Antony Loewenstein, speaking to us from Sydney. Hi there, Antony. So this fighting really escalating in the last hour or so. It's not surprising, but are you surprised at the intensity and possibly what we could call the sophistication of what we've seen from Hamas, especially by its members being able to infiltrate these areas of Israel?
In a way, yes. I mean, one of the things that's often been said for years in relation to Israel and Hamas is Hamas has never presented any kind of existential threat to Israel. Putting what happened today aside, and even what's happening now is not some existential threat to Israel. Hamas is a relatively weak militarily group. I'm not denying the reality of what's happening right now. Of course, that's quite serious, to put it mildly. But the serious threat has always been Hezbollah in Lebanon, militarily towards Israel. You know, one of the things that strikes me about what's happening in Israel now is in some ways, yes, surprised by the fact that we didn't know it was going to happen, of course, but in some ways the political context for this is what the current Israeli government has been doing to Gaza for, as one of your former speakers said, for 17 years. There is a blockade. There are 2.5 million Palestinians living in Gaza under not just an occupation, but an inhumane siege. And Hamas has been controlling that area for obviously many, many years, increasingly brutally, to be sure. They're an Islamist organisation. But in some ways, every 2 or 3 years, there seems to be this flare-up. Nothing like this. This is clearly almost unprecedented. I acknowledge that for sure. But the context for this, which is so often missed in much of the Western press and international coverage, is what is happening to Gaza? What are Israel doing to the Gazan people for the last more than 15 years? And that, I think, is the context that explains the anger and the rage that often comes from Gaza towards Israeli occupation.
It does speak to the fact that you can only push people to a certain point before they have to take action. Israel, often referred to by many people as an apartheid state. Gaza under that blockade, like you say, people there suffering for almost 20 years. But now Israel says that it's launched this, what it's calling Operation Iron Swords. What do you expect this operation to look like, given that we're already seeing strikes on Gaza happening right now?
Look, Israel faces a real problem, and this has been the case for years, having reported from Gaza myself over many, many years, because in many ways, Israel does not want to control the Gaza Strip anymore. I mean, Israel has a choice. They can either overthrow Hamas militarily, assuming that's possible, but even if they do that, and I suspect history would suggest they do not want to do that, they have to control, therefore, and occupy and manage 2.5 million more Palestinians who are living in Gaza. So that is essentially the choice. Israel, as they do every 2 or 3 years, can bomb Gaza, attack Gaza, kill Gazans, kill a huge amount of civilians and journalists, which I fear they're going to be doing in the coming days and weeks. But none of that changes the fact that Israel has made a choice over the last 17 years of not officially reoccupying Gaza. I mean, international law and the UN says correctly that in fact what Israel does is occupy the air, sea and land borders of Gaza. So what I think is going to happen, unless, and the caveat to my comment is, there are numbers of the Israeli cabinet this year, Ben-Gvir and others, the far-right cabinet ministers, who do call for the overthrow of Hamas and Israel essentially retaking control of Gaza. I'd be extremely surprised if that happens. If it does happen, it solves nothing, because you're going to have 2.5 million more Palestinians who have to be managed, in inverted commas, by Israel, which I think Israel has no desire to do, unless and until, and I've said this for years, as many other sane heads have said, unless and until there is a negotiated settlement. Israel has to talk to Hamas. It is the only way to resolve this. It's not a popular thing to say right now, and I'm not defending everything Hamas is doing right now by any means. But ultimately and eventually, Israel has to talk to Hamas. It's the only way this is going to get resolved, unless there is a desire, which I fear there is amongst some in the Israeli military elite now, particularly in the current Israeli government, of indefinite escalation.
Do you think what we're seeing happen today could lead to these talks between Israel's government and Hamas? Because this certainly shows possible weaknesses in Israel's security. And we know that it is a government that is divided. It is the most right-wing it's ever been. Not everyone there agrees with each other or what to do next. And could this possibly be the thing that leads them back to the negotiating table to discuss what's happening, because you have to think, how much longer can people live like this? How much longer can people in Gaza suffer under this occupation?
I wish the answer to that was possibly yes. And the reason I'm skeptical, and I hope my skepticism is misplaced, is that there's really no interest in this current Israeli government. And frankly, what we see Hamas doing currently in Israel, I think, will show that there's very little international pressure on Israel to negotiate with Hamas. I do not see the EU or, frankly, the US, or even, let's be honest, many of the Arab states who are increasingly in bed with Israel. I mean, this is something I've written about and investigated for years, particularly in my new book, The Palestine Laboratory, where I talk about how Arab states, who traditionally, Arab leaders I'm talking about, not so much Arabs as a population, have supported Palestine. That really has changed in the last years. And the Palestinians and Palestine have sadly very few allies in terms of nation states. So yes, it makes sense logically that at some point Israel needs to talk and negotiate with Hamas. But I fear that the kind of more hard heads, the more extreme voices in the Israeli political and military elite will call either for the overthrow of Hamas or some kind of attempted massive escalation as a revenge on what, as you rightly say, there's been a massive security breach. I mean, there's no other way to see that Israel was clearly unprepared for all this. But I wish that there would be saner voices coming out. But even I've seen in the last few hours, in terms of online and elsewhere, you have complete uniformity in Israeli mainstream thought. I've seen very little call for calm, very little call for negotiations. I mean, it's seen as almost treasonous to be saying that. And I think in time you will find some saner Israeli Jewish voices calling for such a thing. I often think about Gideon Levy, who is an Israeli Jewish writer for Haaretz, the liberal Jewish newspaper, who has called for years, despite huge criticism within Israel, to negotiate with Hamas, to talk to Hamas, to actually sit down with them and work out some negotiated settlement. I fear this current action will push that even further away from reality.
It's quite interesting that Israel looks towards normalization with other Arab countries, Saudi Arabia being one of them. But then makes you wonder, how is the Arab world going to respond to this operation in the face of this Israeli operation, which we're already seeing happening in Gaza right now, because many people in Gaza and in the Palestinian world feel like the Arab world has let them down and deserted them.
Well, the Arab leadership certainly has. I mean, virtually every single Arab leadership country, it's very hard to think of many who haven't, frankly, in the last 10 or so years, have abandoned the Palestinians. I mean, it's based on simple fact that they're either normalizing with Israel, they're receiving and buying huge amounts of spyware, repressive technology from Israel. And I think you'll find many Arabs in the Arab and Muslim world do not share that view, will rise up and challenge their leadership about this. Obviously, where that leads, it's impossible to say. But ultimately, I think all these Arab states that are so desperate to normalize, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi potentially soon, Morocco, and others, in some ways, these are elite Arabs dealing with Israeli elites. This is not Arab people. This is not mostly average citizens who are interested in particularly negotiating and befriending Israel when it's occupying and brutalizing Palestinians. So I think this sort of quite remarkable day will really put massive pressure on Arab leaders. And there's a line in the sand. Who do you actually support and stand for? Do you support Israel or do you support Palestinians? And I fear that even if they say publicly that they support the Palestinians, that in fact privately, as we've seen for years, they in fact support Israel.
Absolutely. Antony Loewenstein, live to us there from Sydney. Thank you for your time, Antony, as always.
Thank you so much.